Hey, it's great to be back with you guys. Really, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. That's kind of nice, you know. It's better than it's like, oh, him again. So thank you very. I appreciate that. Well, I'm here by myself today. My wife, Vicky, and kids. My kids, all of the kids, are going on a missions trip. Two separate missions trips this year. My 10-year-old, there's a kids missions trip. She's going up to Loveland to work in a church up there and have a good time. And then my two boys are going on a mission trip to New Mexico on a reservation down there. And so today is kind of at our church a commissioning service for that. And so they're there doing that, and my wife is snapping all the photos and things like that. So but I wish that they were here because it's always better when my family's here. But I'm glad to be with you regardless here today. So hey, did you... were you here last week when Martin and Amy led in worship with Martin and Amy and friends? And so Martin and Amy, Martin was our worship pastor at Dakota Ridge when we were there. And so, man, I'm so excited for that because they're gonna be back to do this a lot as well. And so it's like the band is back together, you know, so where they would do worship and I would preach. And so very excited for that. So anyways, little commercial. I didn't clear this, so, you know, I'll ask for forgiveness later if necessary. But a little commercial just for your enjoyment. If you, I'm putting out a podcast every week. Typically every week. Drops every Tuesday morning, a new episode. And it's about the life of Christ. And incidentally, we're doing a sermon series throughout this whole summer about the life of Christ called In Search of Jesus. And so if you'd like to, it's called Everyday Life Bible Study. And it's everydaylifebiblestudy.com. You can go to iTunes, Spotify, follow there and listen, wherever you like to listen to podcasts, and Everyday Life Bible Study. And it is a walk through the life of Jesus that we're doing. It's my favorite topic. It's Jesus is my favorite thing to talk about, and so favorite person to talk about. And so today, I'm really excited to kick off a summer series that we're going to be doing here about Jesus. So let's get to it. Can we do that? John chapter 4 is where we are here. First 6 verses. This is we're just going to take different looks at episodes in the life of Christ is what we're going to do. They kind of do a series, but I imagine each sermon is pretty much going to be a standalone on its own because it's just little snippets into the life of Christ, little episodes of in his life there. So John chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. This is Jesus meets the woman at the well in Samaria. So John chapter 4, starting in verse 1. Now Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that he was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John, which I don't really know why they cared because they didn't like John either, but they cared. Although in fact it was not Jesus who baptized, but his disciples. So he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now he had to go through Samaria. So he came into a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. So Jesus kind of ran into a little bit of heat, a little bit of trouble down in Jerusalem there. He had been there for the for the Passover festival. And so, and kind of when he got around the religious leaders, he would find himself commonly in a little bit of trouble with them. So he decided, you know what? This whole ministry thing's just kicking off. I'm just gonna leave town, go back home. So, and it says, and he had to go through Samaria. Now, it's been preached, and if you've been a Christian for any length of time, I'm sure you've heard this about the significance of Jesus saying, I have to go through Samaria. It's been preached that good Jews didn't go through Samaria. That between Judea, between Jerusalem, down here and down toward the south, and Galilee up north, there was this area called Samaria. And the problem was there were the Jews in Jerusalem and Judea, Galilee and stuff, and in the middle there were Samaritans who pretty much were the outcasts. They were hated by the Jews, and they didn't care for the Jews much either. Samaritan blood was mingled with pagan blood, and with the Samaritan Jewish blood mingled with pagan blood and became Samaritans and stuff like that. So Jews really just had a problem with them, and so it's been preached over and over and over again. And I've heard this several times myself that Jews, instead of going straight up the quick route through Samaria, would travel around Samaria to get to Galilee. And that Jesus, because he had to go through. Anybody ever heard that preached? Yeah. A few of you have. So, which it sounds great and it sounds good, but if you really research this, you find that it's not exactly true. Self-righteous Jews who were holier than thou type of people, they would travel around. However, it was a very standard practice, apparently, to travel through Samaria. You just didn't really want to stop and hang out is the issue there. So it's true that some Jews did travel around because they were more self-righteous. They didn't. It's not because they didn't want to defile themselves. They just, had an attitude about it and stuff. So if you research this, you realize that, no, Jews really had the permission to travel through Samaria to get to Galilee or vice versa here. Just don't stop and associate and fraternize with the Samaritans kind of thing is the issue here. But the point of all of that, when it didn't, because it is true that some Jews would travel around, but when it was preached that they'd travel around, but Jesus said, no, I have to go through Samaria. Maybe he was traveling a standard route, but he had to go because he was going to do what still was not acceptable, and that is, he's like, look, I got to fraternize with these people. I have a divine appointment with somebody in Samaria here. And so the travel through Samaria, not only permitted, but a common route. People didn't gasp in amazement. His disciples, we don't read about any objection, when he says, hey, I have to go through Samaria, and so they did. People didn't gasp in amazement that he walked that direction. And we know Jesus wasn't this self-righteous person here, even though he was the most righteous. He was opening and welcoming, but maybe that's even a better point to make here, all right? That though he thought nothing of traveling through Samaria. Now, he wasn't making some kind of a statement. Look at me. I'm inclusive. I'm not a racist. I'm walking through Samaria, and I'm not afraid to talk to the people there. Maybe the most inclusive, non-racist way to be is simply just not thinking about or not caring about those differences at all, right? Because Jesus had this view of all people and says, you know what, whether you're Jew, Samaritan, pagan, Gentile, whatever, we're all people that are loved by God. So look, I got to go through Samaria. Let's just get there. And you know what? I'm going to talk to some people on the way. So let's read the story about this episode in Jesus' life. Starting in verse 7. Let's just continue. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, will you give me a drink? His disciples had gone into town to buy food. Otherwise, they would have done it for him. The Samaritan woman said to him, you're a Jew, and I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. And Jesus answered her, if you knew the gift of God and who it was that asked you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. Sir, the woman said, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did all his sons and also his livestock? Jesus answered, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. And it's interesting, Jacob kind of represents an old covenant there, Anyone who drinks of this well, that, from Jacob, who represents his old covenant, that person's going to be thirsty again. But the water I give you're never going to thirst again. So that's pretty cool. But whoever drinks the water, I just said that. Whoever drinks the water I will give them will never thirst again. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life. And the woman said to him, Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water. And he told her, Go back and call your husband. I have no husband, she replied. Jesus said to her, You're right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you've had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have just said is quite true. So, there's a couple of things that really stick out to me in this story here. And the first thing would be associations. Jesus is very cordial. He's very friendly here. She's a Samaritan woman, which is a problem, is that she's a Samaritan and she's a Samaritan woman, which makes it in that culture something that, why in the world is Jesus talking to her, that he's not afraid to talk to her. But also we discover that this is a very sinful woman, a known sinner, not just somebody a Jew's not supposed to talk to, but other Samaritans don't typically give her the time of day either, because she's a known sinner. Because you just didn't get divorced 5 times back then. It just didn't happen like that. She was most likely put away by her husbands, divorced by her husbands for infidelity here. Now she's living with a man. Only known sinners did that. And I know that all sin is sin, and all sin apart from Jesus leads to death. And big or little sin, it doesn't matter. All sin separates us from God, right? But this encounter kind of makes a point. She would have been considered basically a low-down, dirty, rotten scoundrel, sinner, okay? Most likely shunned by others. Yet Jesus sits down by the well there and strikes up a conversation with her. So, water, am I right? Nice well, huh? That kind of thing. I don't know how we started the conversation, but Jesus thought nothing of interacting with her. He was tired from the journey. He sat down by the well. Hey, would you mind giving me some water here? And he thought nothing of this interaction. And there's more. There's this woman. There's Matthew, who he called to be a disciple, this tax collector. We might talk about him later this summer. We'll see. But and why was Jesus talking to him? There was Zacchaeus, who was a known sinner and who got saved and invited Jesus to his house for dinner, and all kinds of other, Bible says, notorious sinners were there with him. Jesus didn't shun away. He didn't shun them. He didn't shy away from these kinds of interactions. The last known conversation that we read about in John's gospel here was with a respected religious leader named Nicodemus. And he shared with Nicodemus how to be saved. And now he's having a similar conversation, a conversation that leads to life with someone whom the likes of Nicodemus would never talk to. You know what I mean? And so there was this wide range of people. He didn't care who you were, what your background was, what your situation was, your social economic status. It really just didn't matter to him. If you were a person and you were there, he would talk to you. He would interact with you. This gospel, this good news is for everyone, isn't it? Thank you. It's for everyone. So as far as his associations go, and some may have, and actually some did, view them as questionable back then, his associations with people, but it just seems like he didn't care. I remember when I was a teenager, I got saved as a teenager and in a great church in Terre Haute, Indiana. That's where I'm from. And every Wednesday night was youth group. And we went to church every Sunday morning, every Sunday night, every Wednesday night, and then we usually had something every Friday night with the youth group, and so it was constantly going there. And man, I just dove right in, got saved. But I remember this. you need to share Jesus. You're a missionary in your high school, and you need to tell people about the love of Christ, and because they need Jesus, and you're the only Jesus they may ever see, and that kind of stuff, right? And so there was this big push to share Christ, to share Christ. On the other hand, there was also this big idea of, you can't have non-Christian friends. Your circle needs to be those who are going to build you up, because what we would say is it's easier to pull somebody down a ladder than to pull them up. And so if you're hanging with people who don't know Jesus, they're just going to pull you down the ladder. And so share Jesus with them, but don't hang out with them. And that's when we would go street witnessing. Anybody ever been street witnessing? Back in the day, right? And what we would do is kind of like this vigilante type stuff. We'd go on somebody unsuspecting person there, strike up a normal conversation, and then bam, bring out the Bible. And if you don't know Jesus, you're going to die and go to hell and these kind of things. And that's what, I don't know what your church was like. That's what my church was like. But anyways, but we'd share this, and it was like we would just jump in, tell them about Jesus, and tell them about the Roman road, and then we would jump out of there, and then we would go have a pizza party afterwards, saying, didn't we do some great things for God? I don't remember anybody ever getting saved from street witnessing, though. Honestly, I'm looking back, and I can't remember one single. Now, I know that there are exceptions. I know that there are those who, maybe some here today, it's like some stranger just told me about Jesus. And it worked, and I believed. And so I'm not saying God can't use that, but in my experience, I don't remember anybody ever getting saved from this swoop in, tell them about Jesus, here's the Roman road, and then swoop out, and I went and had a pizza party, with the youth group. I just don't remember any of that thing happened, and we were shaking in our boots the whole time because we're so afraid of this. That's not the model that Jesus gives us in the Bible. I'm just going to kind of come in, talk to total strangers, and leave. It seems like that he wanted to get to know people. That when this woman was there, he already knew everything about her anyway, but yet there was more than just, can I have some water? Thanks, see ya. It wasn't that. There was this interaction. There was, I want to get to know you. I want you to know me here. There was, and again, the relationships that he had were often criticized. They said that he was a friend of sinners, and they might have meant it in a bad way, but we think of that as a great thing. But are we friends of sinners? You know what I mean? Are we friends of sinners? Are we the light there? And not just for the purpose of being the light, but because we really love people, and that'll lead them to the light. You know what I mean? So do you realize he stayed in Samaria with them for 2 days? I always glossed over this. In verse 39, 41, I don't think this is on screen, but it says that they urged him to stay, and so he stayed with them for 2 days. And it's like, look, yes, it was accepted for people to walk through Samaria, a Jew, to get from one place to another, but you weren't supposed to stay there, okay? You're just supposed to walk through, keep your gaze ahead of you. We're not going to associate here. We're just going to, we could buy food and that kind of stuff, but we're not going to associate. And so straight through. He stayed for 2 days. Whose house do you think he stayed in? I imagine it's probably the sinful woman, her house. She's a brand new believer. Was her non-husband living still there? Probably. And he stayed with them for a couple of days here. This sinful woman who hadn't been a follower. What did his disciples think about all of this? I mean, could you imagine? These have been good Jews their whole life, and obviously new territory for them. Can you imagine what it must have been like for them? We're going to stay here for a couple of days? We're going to stay in her house, in this sinner's house? Are you kidding me? And so I can't imagine what it must have been like for them, but I imagine Jesus was just smiling saying, yep, these are our new friends, and we're going to stay with them, and we're going to love them. And you know what? They've just believed in me. They still got all their pagan practices and stuff, but you know what? They're following me now. And we're going to love on them. We're going to stay with them. It doesn't say what he did with them for a couple of days. I'm sure they laughed. I'm sure they ate food. He probably taught them a lot. It is possible that he did some miracles. Who knows? I'm just speculating here. But it doesn't talk about that. But he stayed with him 2 days, and I'm sure he had a great time. These disciples were good Jews, didn't associate with Samaritans. Now Jesus tells them, guess what, guys? Here we are for a couple of days. So he spoke to her about moving on. He spoke to her about living water. And she thought he was speaking literally here. That I have water that I call living water, like the old-time carpetbaggers, this elixir, and it takes care of everything that you could possibly imagine. I have water, and if you drink this water, you'll never thirst again. And that sounds amazing, she said. I want some of that. She took him very literally here. Wow, there's water like that? I want some of that water. Nicodemus, the religious leader on the complete other end of the spectrum, had the same issue. Took Jesus very literally when Jesus said, you must be born again. And he's, how can a grown man go back into his mother's womb? And ew, but took him very literally. But Jesus was speaking in a spiritual manner, using a metaphor for what he came to do. She was very receptive. Jesus says, awesome, go get your husband. Well, I'm not married. Yeah, I know. Actually, I already know that. And he confronts her sinfulness. Now there's something we like, Here's a sinner. We're going to confront the sin here. Hold up a sign, and tell people how sinful they are. But he didn't do it in an offensive way. So his associations are one thing that stand out to me. Another thing that stands out to me is this grace that he shows. He didn't respond to her in a manner that sent her away. I don't have a husband. Oh, you don't? He didn't play along like, oh, you don't? What's your situation? Oh, well, never mind then. Which was what a good Jew would have done. Well, wouldn't even have gone that far with her. But he didn't respond in a manner that sent her away. Instead, he addressed the problem and offered a solution. He pulled a vanilla ice on her. If you got a problem, I'll solve it, right? And so he vanilla iced her. Well, not just anybody can call you out like that. And so she says, sir, I can see that you're a prophet because you just told me all about myself. And not just anybody can do that. And so I'm picking up something here that you're a prophet here. And so, John, let's continue back in verse 19. After he says, what you said is correct. You don't have a husband, and the guy's not your husband, but you've been married 5 times previously. Verse 19, sir, the woman said, I can see that you're a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem. Woman, Jesus replied, believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you don't know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is Spirit, and his worshipers must worship in the Spirit and in truth. Woman, I know you're not married. You've been married 5 times before, and the guy you're living with now is not your husband. And I don't know, maybe she's trying to change the subject. Ooh, sir, I can see that you're a prophet. So, something's been bugging me here. So if you're a prophet, I want to ask you a question. Maybe she's trying to change the subject away from her. Maybe, who knows? But basically, she says, which mountain? The Jews say, that it must be done, and some translations mentioned it, Mount Moriah, but basically the temple in Jerusalem there on that mount. The Samaritans, the mountain she's referring to is Mount Gerizim, which is the Old Testament Mount of Blessing. And Jesus kind of rolls with the conversation here. Which mountain, where are we supposed to worship here? In Jerusalem with you guys or here? You're a prophet. Tell me what to do. So she obviously wasn't completely lost and degenerate. You know what I mean? So obviously there was some part of her that searched for God. And Jesus rolls with the conversation, but he didn't let it get bogged down in a theological discussion. Long story short, he says, look, the time is coming. He says, actually, it's already here. Anybody can worship God anywhere. Anybody can worship God anywhere. This episode of Jesus' life demonstrates that there's no barriers to the gospel. No barriers to the gospel. Because the Jews believed that the Samaritans were outcasts, that there was a barrier between them and God here. But Jesus is saying, no, it doesn't, honestly, it really doesn't matter. It's neither here nor there. You know, it's the condition of your heart, worshiping Him in spirit and in truth, regardless of where you are. No conditions to meet in order to be accepted by God. No need to get your life together first. I mean, Jesus is busting down walls here, barriers that culture had built up to the gospel. It's breaking two big social customs by talking to a Samaritan and this woman in public, and and didn't even care that she was a sinner. Do you think we have barriers to the gospel today? What are some of those barriers? I'll help you out. What about politics? If you're a Democrat, conservatives don't think you should be here right now. Okay, it's just one of those things. But you know, Republicans and Democrats can worship the Lord together. But that's a barrier. And if you do get saved and you're a Democrat, Republicans think it's only a matter of time before the Holy Spirit convicts you and you start watching Fox News. You know, that's just how it goes because Christians are this and not that. You know what I mean? But here's a Samaritan who just, and I didn't, bring up politics. I don't bring up politics in the church unless I'm mocking it like I just did, okay? But because it doesn't matter. Is a political persuasion a barrier to the gospel? No. Can you think of any other barriers that we have? I just had the one example, so the rest are up to you, okay? Any other barriers we have to the gospel? Different religions? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, within Christianity, there's all kinds of different theologies and things like that even. So, I mean, if you can't, and if you don't think like I do, and there's some groups that say, well, no, I'm sorry, you don't think like we do, so you're out and things. These are barriers that our culture has put up that says, you can't get to God from where you are because of this. You have to change the way you are first, and then you can come to God. You have to remove the barrier, and then you can come to God. You have to remove the barrier before I can really even feel comfortable talking to you. Man, I have some homosexual friends, and they say, I don't belong there. I just don't belong there. People who, like this woman, have something inside that's searching for God. But I don't belong in Christianity. I don't belong. It's a barrier that we say, well, you first have to get rid of that before you can. And Jesus is like, anybody, anywhere, anytime. Anybody, anywhere, anytime. And you know what? I'll take care of the rest. I'll make him watch Fox News. No, I'm just kidding. But he didn't care about these kinds of things. It doesn't matter who you are, where you do it, just worship him. My favorite part of the story is when the disciples get back from buying food. And I wonder how different their interactions were with the Samaritans they had to do business with. Jesus is here sitting at the well, and this woman comes on, and he strikes up a very friendly, life-giving conversation with her. And I wonder if the disciples had the same experience when they were buying food. Did they even look them in the eye? Because Jews don't associate with Samaritans. And to come back and find Jesus willingly just chumming it up with this sinful woman here. How different were their interactions from how Jesus interacted with this woman? What about our interactions? From day to day, what about our interactions? When we see somebody who, and we make this judgment of they don't know Jesus. They may not, but or they look a certain way, or they act a certain way. And I'm sure, there's not those issues. I know Matt's, I believe I know Matt's heart. And so I believe I know the kind of messages that he's preaching and that you're getting there. And it's like, no, this gospel's forever. We love people. And this what'd you call it? Something of hope in a movement of hope in this. And that's awesome. That sounds like the heart of God here. But sometimes in our day-to-day lives and interactions, maybe it's on the job or when we're just out messing around or whatever, do we treat people a little differently? Do we interact with them a little differently based on who we think they might be or not be? Anyway, they come back to give Jesus food, and he's not hungry. Verse 31, it says, meanwhile, his disciples urged him, Rabbi, eat something. But he said to them, I have food to eat that you know nothing about. Then his disciples said to each other, could somebody have brought him food? They were very literal in that day. Nicodemus in the womb, and this woman in living water, and now the disciples I guess he must have eaten, But Jesus is talking in metaphor here. And they said, could someone have brought him food? And he says, my food, Jesus said, is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. Do the will of him who sent me and finish his work. This woman, this sinful woman, is the will and the heart of my Father right here. I'm finishing the work in her life. I have food that you know nothing about. Jesus, in essence, Jesus is feasting here. Man, when he talked to the religious people, the people who should have already had it all together, it was like, man, it was like draining on him almost, it seemed like. But when he was talking to people like this woman, man, he was being filled up. He was feasting here. My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. And all of this had to be astounding, the disciples, don't you think? I mean, this is brand new experience. I'm sure they've never done anything like this before, and they've just joined this guy, and they're not fully convinced yet. And as you read through the Gospels, you realize that he took them on a journey of really understanding who he was. They didn't really understand at this moment that this really was the Son of God. We see later on Peter, saying, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And he says, my Father revealed that to you. But it was a journey of getting to that point here. Definitely a prophet, still trying to figure him out, but he's no ordinary man. I mean, their idea of a Messiah was somebody who would focus on putting the nation of Israel back together. So what is he doing with this woman? Now he's in Samaria among the people the Jews hated the most. They hated each other. And Jesus basically, it's not here when he says this, but it's this, lift up your eyes, for the fields are white to harvest. The fields are ready to be harvested for God's kingdom. I came for these people. These are my people, true worshipers. Maybe this episode was more about the disciples than it was for the woman at the well. She and the other people of town definitely benefited from this, right? But I wonder if Jesus was using this whole thing to teach his disciples something here. I wonder if that's the point for us today. Because I can imagine their wide eyes. What is going on here? They had a prohibition against this kind of stuff. We don't have that. We just have sometimes I just don't want to type of thing going on with us. You know what I mean? Maybe this story was written down for our benefit. Do I tend to avoid people because they're sinful? Because there's obvious sin in their lives. Well, if my goal is to be like Jesus, I got to stop doing that. I got to stop. Because those are the people that Jesus went and struck up a conversation with. This is all about living like Jesus in our world. If our goal is to be like him, this is what he did. Now, back to youth group days, the thought was, man, if you hang around these people, then their pressure is going to get to you. and you're going to become, like them, sinful. You know what I mean? And that's just not what I read in the Word of God. I read that greater is He that is in me than he that is in the world. That the pressure of Christ in me is greater than the pressure of the world outside. And so that when I'm in a situation, that I am light and life. There's a big dark room with a little light in the middle of it. You flip the switch on, what happens? It's a big lit up room, isn't it? That's us. That is us. So I want you, and obviously we use wisdom. Former alcoholic doesn't decide just to go back to the bars to start witnessing to people and sharing Christ. So we use wisdom and things like that, right? But what I'm talking about is our associations, our interactions, and the grace we give through that, just like Jesus did. So I'm pretty much done. So if we need to get ready for communion and things, we're going to be taking communion here. But as we're going around our business this week, let's pay a little. Maybe we might find ourselves in a situation where we feel like, man, I need to pay a little bit more attention to my associations, my interactions here, and who I'm talking to, and how I'm talking to them. Am I avoiding this person, or am I loving and accepting toward that person, or whatever? Can we live like Jesus in this world? He says, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. And we know that on the cross, we're getting ready to take communion here today. On the cross, Jesus said, "It is finished." It is finished. And that one very real physical barrier to God's presence, it was known as this curtain, this veil in the temple. In this temple, that was at that time, it was a big, thick rock structure that you just couldn't just pass through. It was this barrier to God's presence there. And it says at the moment that he died, that the veil of the temple, that was split into from top to bottom, signifying that, God's presence is with people here. And one day, at the end of it all, and if you look at the end of the book in Revelation, it says, now God's dwelling is with men, and that's talking people, and that's talking about, us in his kingdom forever in heaven here. But in the meantime, he's not closing himself up. It's open access for all that anybody, anywhere, anytime can receive the love of Jesus. Don't have to clean up, nothing. Maybe that's a word of hope for somebody here today, because you think, man, I feel my own barriers to God.